Are we filming this?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Honorable panel, this House would nationalize and provide access to the metadata being gathered by online multinational companies. And we would do this for a few reasons, but first I'm going to set up a model for you. So first of all, metadata refers to the aggregate data that's being mined by these multinational corporations. This isn't talking about any kind of personal information that could involve doxing and that sort of thing, right? So we're talking about like how many people visit certain websites and their buying power and their like Fitbit data, right, for like groups of people. So we're not talking about like Steve Jones did this, right? All right. Now we would do this for a few reasons. First of all, it evens the playing field. So we think that this is true for a few reasons. First of all, we think that this is good for non-profit incentivized organizations. So we think that this will allow non-profits to not have to spend their money getting this data, and so therefore not like wasting that money, or if they don't have the access to money to do that, to just like be better at fundraising in general, which we think that would be able to help a lot more people. So we think that like if other smaller organizations that are able to like provide aid for refugees are able to get this data, then we can have like not things like the Susan G. Komen Foundation taking like all of the money from everybody and using it really badly. So we think that this would be like a better, more equitable distribution of money through nonprofits. We also think that this would be better for marginalized communities. So we think that like most of the time these multinational corporations are run by like very wealthy white men, and you can see this by looking at like the statistics of what the 500 companies are, right? The Fortune 500 companies. There are like very few female CEOs. There are very few people of color as CEOs, and so we think that there have been these movements recently, especially like among like Black communities, in order to go to Black-owned businesses and this sort of thing. And we think that this would be a way to even that playing field and allow for the businesses of marginalized communities to be like much more able to get to target the people that they think would want to go to them, instead of like Dove targeting their like diversity ad at those people, so that they'll go to buy their soap. We think that this would be like much better on balance. Next, we think that it would be like create a more financially stable small businesses, and then we think that this would be important for the consumer for a couple of reasons. We think that like not only would it help these marginalized communities and help nonprofits, we also think that it's better for the consumer when there are more financially viable organizations that they could buy from, and we think this is like businesses are less likely, these huge multinational corporations are less likely to like create monopolies when there are people like that can use this advertising for their own financial gain. We think that this is also important for the consumer. And lastly, we think that this gives the consumer a choice, and we think that this is really important. Because consumers are able to like understand what they're getting into. We think that like when consumers are able to like look at the different prices from different companies, and when they're able to see advertisements from like all sort like a variety of things, we think this is like necessarily creates better choices for the consumer. And we think that like as a whole, this would create like a happier, like more responsive public that's able to like make the choices that they want in the ways that they want. And they'll be better equipped to like create a better quality of life for themselves. Like if they're getting like, you know, it works the same way as propaganda does. If you're getting propaganda all from one source, you're much more likely to be like fervently for that thing. But if you're getting it from a variety of different ways, you're much more likely to like be able to differentiate between them, and be like a more like a smarter consumer, right? Who's able to like make the right choices. And lastly, we think that it's incredibly important to bring this data mining to the media's attention. So we think that what all of this does is it creates sort of an even playing field, and we think that like some of these ways that this data is mined is okay, like in terms of like looking at like how like at how many like Iowans visit this like corn website or whatever, but but we think that some of it is actually really harmful and destructive, and we think that things like insurance companies looking at what kind of like websites you use and using that to adjust your insurance premiums, that's like a harmful way that this is used. We think that if this is brought to the media's attention and to the public's attention, that people are much more likely to insist on different like regulations for the ways that this is used, which right now, being very like shadowy and secretive, people are not really aware of it enough to make sure that it's being used in the correct ways. So we think that like in China, where a filmmaker recently like made a film called Dragonfly Eyes out of like surveillance footage, wherein he like sort of cut together all this surveillance footage to make like this very personal story, and this sort of brought to the attention that like the Chinese citizens that they are being filmed constantly, and sort of like brought this as a wave of like a pushback against that. We think that in making this public, we would be much more likely to have a pushback against these like hazardous and destructive ways that people are using data mining. So before I go into deeper analysis, does anyone have a point of information?
Yeah, so your first point about how this evens the playing field for small businesses. Normally small businesses have a smaller field of operation. How does it help a small business in, say, Montana to know about the consumer data in Connecticut, or like the comparative national consumer data, when they could just get the information locally?
Okay, so I think that this is probably not super germane in terms of like if you're having like a hardware store in Montana, they're probably not going to be like using this data anyway, like that particular example. But we also think that like there are a lot of small businesses that are competitive in places that also have larger businesses, and probably in like New York, where there are like a million of them, or even Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I come from. It's like the highest per capita nonprofits, and we think that this is really important for places wherein the market is competitive. In this example, your hardware store is probably a monopoly anyway, and maybe like doesn't really use the internet, so we think that like that doesn't really apply to this example. But like so for places where there are different businesses, which is like almost everywhere, and probably in certain places in Montana also, maybe not this like one rural city like place that you're talking about, but like almost everywhere there are like different levels of businesses, right? So we're talking about like the example that I brought up in my speech with Dove sort of like targeting Black communities. We think that it's like better for smaller businesses within those communities to be able to target people. And so because we think that it evens the playing field, allows for better targeted aid, allows for marginalized communities to be built up, and allows for monopolies to be brought down, as well as giving consumers a choice and creating the public motivation for change and regulation against these data mining policies, we strongly urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Wait, what?
No, we're just like.
Okay. Oh man, this is all wet.
Sorry.
No, that's my fault. What? That's my jacket. Okay.
How was that your fault?
Oh no, my jacket's all wet and I put it down and it got tabled up. As side opposition, we would not nationalize and provide public access to this metadata being gathered by online multinational companies. We want to restrict the access of this metadata solely to the multinational companies and prevent the public from accessing it. And we have 3 reasons why. So, to begin, the companies that rely on like profiting off of this metadata would suffer and fail. And these companies are currently the structure and the framework behind our globalized society. So, for example, Facebook, LinkedIn, social networks in general, and even search engines rely on this metadata in order to survive, and that is basically their business model. So this would cause like a shift in their entire business model to become more predatory and to begin to exclude individuals. So, for example, they could institute like paywalls or like registration fees. So, for example, if I would want to sign up to create a Facebook profile, I would have to pay $15, and I would have to perhaps even have a monthly fee in order to stay registered to Facebook. And if SideGov truly cares about marginalized individuals, like they argued earlier in their speech, then why would they create these sort of like? Why would they sort of push out individuals who can actually not pay for these like paywalls, like registration fees, and this is actually hurting marginalized people in the end, and not even just marginalized communities that like are trying to create businesses, but marginalized communities as a whole, because we have billions of people on Facebook and billions of people using these social networks. Sorry, not right now. And that this will also create like less money in the consumers' pockets, and less money for the consumers to actually use for small businesses. So this cross applies to the other point about how small businesses like need to thrive with this metadata. Well, how can small businesses thrive if individuals have to now pay for all the things they currently use in their life? So we all use Facebook, we all use LinkedIn, we all use Twitter. Sorry, not right now. We all use many of these metadata sites and Google, and we would have to now pay subscriptions and other type of paywalls that they would institute. And with this, we would have less money in our pockets. And for those who have very little money in their pockets to begin with, now they don't have the ability to shop at these small businesses, and they have to shop at larger businesses which cut prices and have terrible labor laws in the first place. Sorry, not right now. So, and on to our second point. So, with this, with this metadata becoming accessible to the public, this can actually like pose a threat to individuals. Not only does it remind people that they're being sort of like washed, and it creates this sort of like anxiety in society, and like this distrust with the government, and with this sort of like larger theme of just like authority, but it also opens the door for like terrorist individuals and like groups, the less complex ones, which don't have access to metadata in the first place and could not pay for metadata. They have easier access to this metadata to carry out like attacks that, for example, like if they know that certain areas have like a high traffic of phone calls, or if certain areas just like are prone to like are like very like popular, and so like if a terrorist from an international from like a foreign company comes to the United States, for example, and they're aiming to carry out a terrorist attack in a certain location, like in a certain city, then they would use all of this like metadata in order to confirm where individuals meet and what kind of group they want to target. And it's metadata that, even though it's supposed to be depersonalized, still reflects the actions of human beings, and that's something that we want to stress. Yes, go ahead.
On your first point, the companies that you named, like Facebook and LinkedIn, are advertisers. Why would this hurt them? This is like saying that like a billboard company will lose business if everyone's now allowed to advertise on their billboard.
Well, many of these like social media sites and like phone carriers and things, they still provide metadata to like multinational companies, and like this is similar to the NSA and how like all this metadata is trafficked from individuals to these multinational companies, and they're paid for this data. So similar to how like Facebook gives our information to like outside sources, and how Verizon Wireless and AT&T give our information to outside sources, like how, like what we click on, what we prefer, and Verizon Wireless gives like phone call data, how long we talk, like what kind of text messages we're sending, like what kind of apps we're using, how much we're using the apps. No, sorry, not right now. Yeah, so moving on to the PM's speech. So on their first argument that this is sort of like better for marginalized communities, and this current space is like white dominated, we do agree that this space is like white dominated but by like putting less money in the individual's pockets, especially those who like have less money and have a lower income, which tend to be minority groups, that they will not have the ability to even like participate in the market in the first place. And that and moving on to their point about how this like creates like a situation of like more financial stability for small businesses. Metadata isn't even used for small businesses, and Kaylee brought up a great point that even if we're talking about small businesses that exist in like in a diverse community like Chicago, with like many types of businesses, large and small, that somehow these small businesses are going to grow because these larger businesses, because they're on the same playing field, they have the same access to these large businesses. Yes, they might have the metadata, like they might have this like tool, but they do not have like the actual labor in order to input to like use. Sorry, not right now. To like use this tool, so they might not have enough people to actually scour all this metadata and pinpoint like what exactly they need. They might not have like the funds in order to implement certain like changes that are required in order to accommodate for this metadata. For example, if a small mom and pop shop needs to compete with Target on candy for Halloween, they might not necessarily be able to buy a certain type of candy that Target is, not because they don't know which candy. Everyone loves Whoppers, and we haven't been selling Whoppers, so now they find out they need to sell Whoppers, but Whoppers, like this certain branch of Whoppers is only sold in like a very far location. Target only has the funds. The mom and pop store doesn't have the funds. So even though the mom and pop store only knows about the metadata as well in the status quo, they still cannot they still cannot thrive. So, and also on the argument that it gives consumers choices, well, small businesses and like all these alternative products still exist and thrive in the status quo, and like growth of new brands occurs daily, even without them having metadata. So it's all about like the economic the capitalism works that if consumers prefer a certain type of product, even if it's from a humble small business, they're gonna purchase it nonetheless. They care less about like quantity and more about like the quality of a product, and that's how small businesses become large businesses. And on the argument that it brings like data to like media attention. Well, if the government believes that like businesses abuse metadata in the first place, then they're actually worsening it in their world by providing it to all people. So if metadata can be abused, why give it to all businesses and not just large businesses? And for all these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
I'm gonna be late. Okay.
Oh, no.
I have a fellowship meeting at 6. I emailed them and told them I was gonna be late. I'm a good fellow right now, so hopefully they're not mad at me. Yeah, I should have done this on Tuesday. Okay.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Honorable Speaker, Saren really wants me to start my speech by saying that if someone can die from having too much water, why give anyone water at all? Let's just deprive certain groups of water instead of giving it to everyone. Okay, moving on to my speech. We think that, like, what's really important about this debate, like every debate ever, is that we need to be thinking about the comparative. On our side of the house, or on their side of the house, the only people who have access to this information are very wealthy companies who are large, who are able to spend large amounts of money getting access to this data. We think there are still going to be people who have access to this data, right? Like, you're not actually protecting the privacy of individuals involved. It's the same data that is still accessed by other people. On our side of the house, now this data is able to be accessed by all people, equalizing the playing field, meaning that small businesses and advocacy groups and the government are able to use this data to make people's lives better, to provide better products, and to strengthen the economy, get rid of monopolies, all sorts of good stuff. We think that they don't get better privacy. We think that instead they get more malicious systems where people aren't aware of the way their data is being used. We think that that is far worse, sure. Actually, you're out of... No, you're... Yeah. Sure.
Okay, if this metadata gathered by these corporations becomes a public good, why would these companies be incentivized to continue data mining if it's simply going to be used by their competitors in the businesses below them?
Okay, so first, the metadata is being collected like all the time, everything that we do. The way that the internet and computers work is that they don't delete anything, right? Like, they just save all of the information and then they sell it off to other companies. We think that this data is still going to be collected, but now instead of selling it to companies, the government is going to take it and aggregate it and make it available to all citizens. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about why consumer data is incredibly useful for companies and why it's good that small businesses are able to access it. And then I'm going to talk about how this evens the playing field and how that is really, really important, how this data can be used for good things. And then I'm going to talk about how we get better privacy for individuals and how we get a better push for people understanding the way that data is used and understanding that the way that they interact online can be monitored, understanding that we're going to get better policy in the long run. So first I'm going to talk about how consumer data is useful for small businesses and why that's really, really important, because Kaylee gives this POI that a Montana store is not going to have use for this data at all. First, I think that this data is being collected for people in Montana, right? They're going to be able to see the way that people in their area are interacting with the market. They can see how much people are willing to spend on a shovel online, and they're able to change their prices accordingly in order to be more competitive, so people are more likely to buy their store. But I also think that we live in a globalizing world where people are more likely to buy things online, where small businesses put a lot of their emphasis on targeting different groups on the internet through like all sorts of different websites and platforms. And like the idea that like a Montana store is only selling to people within their neighborhood is actually very quickly changing and no longer the case. Lots of small businesses and startups target larger markets through the internet. We think that we want small businesses to have access to data that can help them reach out to people who will become their clientele, because what you're getting are better products that are more targeted towards people who are going to appreciate them. You see this all the time in products that are changing markets, like more affordable organic tampons and stuff like that, where they're able to use data in order to find people who will support them and get products to people who live across the country and across the world, which you can't have if a really quality product that can make people's lives better is only located in one specific area. We think that that is a really major benefit. But we also think that like a major way that these international, like large-scale corporations are able to maintain their corner on the market and maintain like something similar to monopolies is because they're able to spend lots of money on this data in order to market specifically to people who are going to buy their products. So you see this in a company like Dove, which is trying to like corner the idea of like activist soap or whatever, and spends lots and lots of money making sure that that pops up on everyone's Facebook feed, making sure that like people see images that are associated with their soap in order to like corner the market. We think it's better when more people have access to this data and are able to advertise in the same way, accessing the market in a way that's like more effective for them. We think that like right now these large companies are the only ones who can access helpful data because it's really, really expensive, but also because and like doing their own studies and accessing data that they collect themselves requires lots of research and knowledge, and it's difficult. Whereas like once it's set up on the government database, it's much easier to access. But I think that this is also really, really important because it really does a lot to even the playing field, which is incredibly important, because this data can be really useful for people who are like trying to do activist work, who are trying to find others who support their issues, and who are trying to like put better policies into place that can help people. When the government has access to this information, when like NGOs and are able to access it, which they can't do now because it's really expensive, then they're able to do really, really beneficial things, like put programs in place that will actually benefit people instead of like having like really ineffective programs like a lot of welfare programs where they're not actually solving the problems that they're trying to. So we get the argument from opening opposition that this is going to cause harms to marginalized people because these companies are going to become predatory. As my partner told you, all of the companies that he's talking about make most of their money from advertising, not from the collection of metadata. And we think that like even if that's the case, and they make lots of money from metadata, the paywalls that they would set up are not going to be that expensive. They can't be prohibitively expensive because people just hate paying for things that have previously been free. Facebook literally says that it's free and always will be. That's something that they stand by. And when you try to make something cost money at all, people just stop using your app. A free one will pop up that serves basically the same purpose. People will switch to that. Their stock will go down. They'll basically lose their business. We think that you're never going to get something that is actually prohibitively expensive. Like, even if it is, it'll probably be like a couple of dollars. We're willing to bite the cost that this might possibly charge a couple of dollars if it means that you're able to get like fairer access to information. We think that that is like a much bigger benefit. We also think that on their argument about like this causing anxiety, first, like the police are going to get access to this information too, which they like don't have right now because it's expensive. But we also think that like right now people aren't aware that this data is online, right? So like people think that their use of the internet is private, that no one can access it, that like their privacy is safe. But the thing is, like, it really isn't. Everything that we do is being collected all the time. We think it's better that people are aware of that and are able to then make better decisions about how they interact online, but also better decisions when policy comes up in order to make sure that their rights are protected, in order to make sure that the government is serving them well and that corporations aren't getting information that they wouldn't want them to have. Thank you, proud to propose. I have to go. Someone will bring my laptop to me?
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, I hope it's not raining still.
Raining. I'm just kidding.
Wait, because we've been for your test.
He was in the bathroom when I was freaking out about how I was going to be late.
You're late.
I'm late. I'm quite late.
Should run.
I'm not going to run. I might run. Bye.
Good luck.
Okay, so the debate that we've heard so far really comes down to two central issues, the issue of quality and the issue of accessibility. Government has tried to hang their hat on the issue of accessibility, and we think that we've beat them in that quarter. But we also would like to point out the fact that all of their impacts that they get from the accessibility argument are entirely dependent on good data being produced. If the data suddenly becomes shit, then there's no benefit to making it equally accessible to everyone. No one gets benefit from shit data, right? And everyone's assuming that data is generally a good thing. So, let's look at the argumentation that's been brought up about how this shift will necessarily harm the integrity of data. We hear from Tarek this argument that the profit incentive is integral to driving production of good data. And this is because it costs money to collect data, it costs money to organize data, it costs money to put this up on websites. And basically the only response we got, this was pretty much dismissed, even though it is integral to this debate, is the idea that like the government will do it instead and it'll be fine. The government does everything as well as private businesses, right? But in history, across the world, we've seen that most efforts to nationalize any industries don't go that well. Partially, this is because currently in the capitalist profit-driven model, companies have a really strong direct incentive to produce good data, right? So like if they produce good data, they will get paid, and then that is that direct result for them. The government incentive is a lot more murky. And in this particular case, it's especially murky because the real benefit will be going to the companies who are then using this data, right? So it's not like a general public service, it's to whatever companies are accessing this data. So we think that this is really problematic. But secondly, we just think that in general, like government bureaucrats tend to be worse at these kinds of jobs than, you know, the people who have lots of money to hire people who are really specialized and good at these jobs. We think that necessarily this will result in worse data, which is a harm to everyone who relies on this data. Yes, Sarah.
Okay, the response to this point was that these people are advertisers. So Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of these people advertise. So having other people be aware of that data, that will just make them get more money from these people wanting to advertise on their platforms, which will incentivize them to create more data.
I think you're a little confused. That's the response to a different point that I'll deal with later. We're talking about right now the incentive to collect data itself, and like if now they can't make money from data, they won't collect data, which means that data will not be collected well. And all the benefit you're talking about to small businesses only happens if there's data that that small business can access, right? So like there is no benefit if the data isn't good. This is a link to your entire case, and all of your impacts fall without this link that you really haven't done a good job of complicating. Okay, but even if you don't buy this, right, even if you're like, yeah, maybe the data will be okay, which we think is really problematic and probably not true, but whatever, you don't buy this. Let's look at accessibility, and there's accessibility to two different ideas that have come up in this round. The first is accessibility to data, right? So they say that now small businesses will have access to data, and this is such a huge impact that we need to make it available to everyone, and that's kind of like what the round turns on from them. But we have a lot of responses to this to tell you. First of all, there's the idea that the data will be worse, so it won't actually be helpful. Second of all, we tell you that like small businesses are not the ones who are using this data, right? So we think that usually small businesses have a really specifically targeted thing that they're doing, and they're doing it because they already have a way of sensing that this is like a need in the economy. If you don't think this is a great idea and you don't have some kind of evidence that people will buy your product, you don't suddenly change from your 9 to 5 to go start a business, right? So like this is not the data that they need. Furthermore, we think that small businesses need other things more than data, right? So like if you asked if you ask a small business owner, they would rather get startup capital than access to data. And even beyond that, if it is true that they really, really need this data, they generally need really limited data because small businesses, by their nature, have a limited service that they provide, right? And so they only need to know, like, the people in New York Fitbit information if they have this specific fitness company in New York. Purchasing that data, because it is so limited, is a lot cheaper. So it like scales down to the size of the data that you need. We think that this is accessible in the status quo for businesses, and it's not that problematic. But even if it weren't accessible, have the government provide targeted grants for those companies who so desperately need this data to compete in the real world. And that's a much better solution than nationalizing the entire industry and making all of the data that everyone consumes shit. Yes, Dave.
Yeah, so how on side op do you guys justify commodifying individuals and basically treating individuals' trends and behaviors as private properties that you're then going to resell to marketing agencies and other advertisers?
I think Closing Gov didn't listen to the model when it was talking about how this data isn't actually personalized. You're not really commodifying individuals. All you're doing is collecting data on general traits, and recognize that that happens on both sides of the house. So like the data is still being collected unless you're knifing Opening Gov, because their entire benefit rests on the idea that small business owners now have access to this data, right? Okay. So that deals with the whole idea of like evening the playing field. And then they talk about, and the final point on evening the playing field is basically like data is not the meaningful difference between Walmart and like the local grocery store, right? We think that there's a fundamental difference in the level of capital that is backing those two things, and it's not just the data that they receive and so they can design their products. It's things like advertising. And if, as they claim, we're just going to switch all of our sites to an advertising model, then they'll just outcompete them in advertising, right? They haven't done enough to link the idea that suddenly this data is going to be the difference between like small businesses competing and not competing, and we don't really buy that idea. We think that startup capital is far more important, and that's what the government should be focusing its efforts on if this is the problem that it wants to fix. Okay, but lastly, and this is a really important impact in this round, right, is access to companies that are central to society. So access to like social media platforms, right? Things like Twitter, things like Instagram, things like Facebook. Lots of these companies rely currently, their primary source of income is selling metadata, right? So they've tried to claim that it's advertising. The incomes for advertising is actually pretty marginal as compared to the amount of money that is made through metadata. So we think that it would require a massive shift in the model that companies like Facebook, and especially companies that don't rely as heavily on advertising like Instagram, use. What does this mean? It means that likely now you have to pay to use it. And Charlotte just tried to like dismiss this, but we think that this is actually a really concrete harm to marginalized communities. Sure, maybe like $10 isn't that much one time for Charlotte who goes to Middlebury, but that can be a meaningful price for people in other financial situations. And furthermore, you have to pay for all of these different services now, which adds up, right? We think this is a meaningful barrier. So because this would prevent access for marginalized communities to these really integral services, we are proud to oppose. I thought I had 8 minutes. My bad. I'm always sassy when I debate.
So do I start, when in BT do I start banging on the table? Is there like a grace period or not?
It's the grace period. It's from 7 to 7:15.
Sorry,
Yeah.
5 people answered, so can one person answer?
There's a 15-second grace period.
Yeah.
You can either start at 6:45 or you can start at 7 and Mike if you want them to go into their either from 6:45.
Wait, what? No. So the grace period goes to 7:15.
Yeah, that's what I
Once
said.
they
There's a
hit
15
7
seconds.
minutes, what do you say after 15 seconds?
Why are you trying to
Okay,
simplify?
sure, that's all I want to know.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
enough, thanks.
7 minutes.
Excellent.
We're supposed to talk.
You're not supposed to.
No.
That's debate. It's
No.
a simple question. That's not.
Okay, fair. I got a convincing argument.
Yeah.
I appreciate the
Sorry.
debating.
Don't
I borrow a phone?
Put it down.
Can I borrow a phone? Can I borrow a phone? Hi, I'm Dan. Hi.
That's super
Nice to
weird.
see you. I don't know what else to do. I'm nervous. Can I borrow a phone? I don't have a phone.
Does anyone?
I mean, I could use my phone, but then
No, that's fine. You need your phone. Everyone ready? Awesome. So I think what opening government really hasn't done yet, and what we want to do for you is extend the model and tell you why this makes such a big difference, given the world that we live in today, and how we give you the most long-term benefits on our side of the house. So, what does the aggregated data that this is that
this is going to be in the form of actually look like? Well, we think it looks like, more often than not, the websites that people are visiting, social trends, what people are doing on a daily basis. Maybe it's not specified, but you see what your community looks like in a way that we haven't seen before, and in a way that is 100% available. So now we get to see what kind of porn do people like, how many self-help groups people visit, who is having marital troubles, who is thinking about visiting a therapist, who is considering suicide. All of those things are now much more available for public use. And with that information is how we get you the biggest benefits that win this debate. Because the reality is, the world that we live in today is so much more digital and is getting digital every day. Data, unlike what side opposition wants you to believe, is not going away. It's constantly being aggregated. My friend has an Alexa. That thing listens to you 24/7. Like literally, you say something and Alexa thinks you're talking to Alexa. And so they'll say, "Oh, hi, I hear that you're talking to me." For those of you that don't know, Alexa is a little robot thing that you put in your house that listens to you, and you can ask to do things for you, like boil your coffee or play Spotify songs that you like based on your own listening history. It's really weird, but that data is being produced and more products are available every single day. Additionally, we have Snapchat, Instagram. There are more photos taken in 2 minutes today than in the entirety of the 19th century. We are a digitalized world. That information, that data is not going away. Everyone's got a phone in their pockets. It's probably listening to you. Now, to start off with some rebuttal, on the issue of safety, right, we think that all of this information being available is going to make the government, like one of its primary jobs being keeping us safe, so much more effective. The CIA, the FBI are now going to be able to know what information criminals are looking at. Right now, when information gets passed, a terrorist group got access to like Facebook's information, now wants to target suburbs when people are generally on vacation, the FBI now knows what that information is and knows where to go and knows what to do about it. We are going to end up with a much safer world, not right now. And over time, this is going to help people because we now get the government analyzing all of this information. It's not wiretapping people because it already has everyone's wiretapped information as stored in this aggregate database, or at least the trends of people's general things that they want to look at. We also, as far as paying for services, companies develop new income streams all the time when their other income streams go dead, right? We see tech companies being especially innovative on this front. We don't think that losing this income stream of collecting metadata as being a death sentence. We also think that the bad data issue is super a moot point. Why? Because data is never the end goal. Companies do their jobs better, provide better services when they get better data, right? So we think that even if this data is not staying in this like little side market of data sharing companies still want really good data because then they can provide you the best porn websites that you're gonna click on, see those advertisements, and make them money. They're gonna provide you the best marital help counselors. They're gonna provide you the best services that you need based on personalized information about your subsection of society, right? About the certain subgroup that you fall into. Companies want that information, and they want that information to be so much more developed. So this debate is not about quality versus accessibility. You can have accessibility and quality. I don't know why they chose that route. It's a really bad advocacy. Additionally, we think this debate is about public versus private property and the long-term benefits of thank you, Judge, the long-term benefits of public property, right? Because when the government has access to stuff, you get a lot of things, and this is going to be our main extension. Because when a government can provide every single person in the world access to something, you get scientists running to that information like dogs chasing a banana. Do dogs chase bananas? I'm not sure. You get scientists running to that information, using it. Do you know the biggest problem with so many econ research papers right now is that people can't get information to tax records. There's literally one dude at Stanford that owns everyone's tax records and only uses it for his own research because that's his incentive. If every great economist in the world, if every economist at Middlebury College had access to every individual's tax records, or at least aggregated tax records, we would have a much better understanding of where income goes, how many dependents people have, how people structure their families, and what people do with that money, right? And that research is really helpful. So now if we know what porn websites people like, and I'm really sticking to this example because I love it, now we know what people are struggling with, what people might want more of, how to structure society so that we get maybe, I don't know, better porn, or at least more, or at least understand the effects of porn on society, which can oftentimes be very harmful and objectifying. And maybe we can figure out what people are interested in and create things that suit them, that are more socially conscious, and don't abuse and manipulate young people into joining these industries, right? So we think that more research leads to more truth about the world, and more information that we have leads us to make better decisions, right? We also think that this will lead to destigmatization and normalization of trends, right? And we think that one of the prototypical examples for this is learning how many people, for example, are gay, or are Googling, oh, am I gay? Learning how many people, it's a thing. Learning how many people are thinking about or struggling with mental health, right? So it destigmatizes these issues because people have a natural desire not to want to be alone. The scariest thing is being alone in the world and thinking that there is no one like you, right? Because we want companionship. That's just how we are as a species. So when we see that other people share either our values or share our struggles, and when we see that in data, because this data is obviously going to be picked through by news sources everywhere, it's going to be made available in consumable ways. It's not just going to stay in this database, right? So we think that when people have access to this data, when people see a million articles being like, you're not alone, there are this many people like you, when people put numbers to those facts, they feel less alone, and many social trends get destigmatized because we know how many people are looking at this sort of thing online. I'm going to drop the porn thing. I've gone too far with it. And I had another thing about commodification of people and how we really don't want to, because that's all capitalism is commodifying like people, places, things, and that's not good. But I'll leave that for my partner. Thank you.
Better porn.
I'm serious. We could use more feminist porn.
Would it be more feminist though?
Yes, because if we know what things like okay, we'll discuss this.
Okay.
Okay. Did you drew that whole thing?
What?
Did you draw that all just throughout this debate?
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Before I begin my speech, I just want to clarify one thing. Side government's entire case, their entire argument rests on the continued efficacy and the continued quality of metadata gathered by multinational corporations.
Hear, hear.
That much cannot be denied. Now, if we're operating under that in order for all these supposed benefits to be attained through the continued use of this metadata, that the data needs to be effective, and the data needs to be thorough, and the data needs to be continued to be gathered at least the same rate that it's being gathered now. You see that before they even begin, side government loses this debate because of the very nature of capitalism. Data mining occurs at the scale that it does, and this is my first independent point. Data mining occurs at the scale that it does because it's an incentive for these companies, because they use this data to get a leg up on their competition and to become more effective marketers and just be more effective at reaching their customers. I fail to see how and we are dealing with, again, because of the motion, we're not dealing with the metadata that's just gathered in your hard drive. We're dealing with metadata that is gathered by multinational corporations, presumably for the purpose of marketing. And if the incentive for data mining is completely removed, then what will be the incentive for these companies to maintain their infrastructure for data gathering if this data can no longer be used just exclusively by them? I fail to see why these multinational corporations would continue to pour millions and millions and millions of dollars into a side of their business that no longer solely benefits them. That's just not right now. That just is completely contrary to what the actual purpose of data mining is. It's just, why would it's just basic economics. If there's no profit in a side of a business, it's just natural for a firm to move away from that side of the business. And this leads into my next point, which is also a response to the member of government's point about innovation, which I do believe is an interesting and valid point, but in all the wrong ways. If the point of this is to say, okay, if we sort of make this data public, they'll innovate and find other ways to reach their customers and more effective ways to gather data. That could be a problem, because presumably if the problem with this metadata is that it's just these are people and these are their habits and they're being used by these companies to make millions of dollars, what's to say these companies won't find even more invasive practices to recoup their revenue? What is to stop them from doing something even more shady? Maybe instead of metadata, we're dealing with personal data. Maybe we're dealing with people's personal habits. No, thank you, not right now. It's just I just fail to see how, like, you're gonna say, oh, we're gonna tell them they can't do they have to make this this very expensive part of their business model a public good. That I just fail to see how this won't lead to a potentially more invasive form of data gathering and marketing than we have now.
On that point?
Not right now. Yeah. If it's just basically when you're looking at the motion and what side government is really proposing, it's just, if the purpose of this motion is to help small businesses and to just make this data a public good that will help people and have all these positive benefits, I fail to see how this motion is effective in any way in achieving these goals. If you can't really realistically convince me that the quality of data will not go down if you remove the profit incentive of gathering metadata, I fail to see why why metadata will persist at the same quality as it does now if there is no real advantage or profit motivation to be had by a firm to continue data mining in the type of data that we're talking about now. Yes, I'll take that.
So one, government regulation totally takes care of people finding more invasive ways, because the government now has more information on the basis of which to regulate. And also, data is still a means to an end, like we said, right? And people want data to create better products, not just data for data's sake.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, but this motion is a very specific motion. We're dealing with metadata gathered by these companies. Do not believe that this motion, in effect, deals with potentially future more invasive ways of gathering data, because it is a very specific, very direct motion that attacks a very specific issue. It's not a broad motion at all.
Well,
so I fail to see that right now. So it just seems like this. It's hard for me to believe that this will not lead to more invasive, more shady practices that will harm the average person in the future, because you're simply taking away a huge source of revenue and a huge source of efficacy out of these businesses. And this leads me into my next point. When you go onto Facebook, LinkedIn, or create a Google account, what do you do after you create your username and password? You sign a terms of service agreement. You, as a consumer, have entered into an agreement with that firm. You are telling them that this metadata is theirs now. The metadata that we are talking about seizing is private property, and this creates a very troubling precedent for seizing the private property of these companies. You see, these companies have poured millions and millions and millions of dollars into their data mining departments to more effectively market and more effectively reach their customers, and to also just increase their profit by selling this metadata, again, that they have not taken without consent. People sign terms of service agreements. So I just believe that not only is this motion completely ineffective at achieving the benefits to society that the government claims it does, but it also but it also sets a very dangerous and morally gray perspective on seizing the private property of businesses, especially these. Yes.
So, do people sign terms of service agreements because they want to, or because?
Oh wait, I'm in protect too. Yeah. Yeah, but no, it's just they're signing these terms of service agreements, and they are entering into a binding legal agreement with these companies to allow them to use their data for certain purposes. So this is not like a clandestine thing that people are doing behind like closed doors. This is a very real and very large part of online firms. So I do believe that this does infringe on their right to private property, and it sets a very dangerous precedent. And Yeah, it's just like to respond to one of the points made by the member of government, talking about how this will also make government, like law enforcement and homeland security, more effective. I think that underestimating the efficacy of the government's apparatus for gathering intelligence by saying metadata is going to help it is a little bit naive. And it is for these reasons and many more that I'm proud to oppose.
I know you were told. So I think what's typically done is one bang at 6 minutes, two bangs at 7 minutes, and then three bangs at 7 minutes and 15 seconds.
Yeah, so like count them out at 7 days.
Yeah, or you can count them out. I just,
Okay, that's also fine. Let's make sense.
that just sounded weird to me. I was like, why would you ask?
So we got one bang is 6
Yeah,
minutes.
because that's protected time.
That we know.
And so one bang at 1 minute, one bang at 6 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got it. Fine.
Alright.
Alright.
I'm not the speaker. That's the main point here.
Honorable chairs. First, let me start by saying, I don't know about you, but I've never actually read a terms of service agreement from start to finish.
Here.
I'm going to start off by telling you that no one in our society currently signs the terms of service agreements because they want to. They sign it because if they don't, they are inherently going to be excluded from accessing whatever good or service that they're looking to access. And given the fact that Facebook has a market share of over 3 billion users, it is almost impossible, and it is literally impractical in this day and age to be in our society and not have a Facebook account, and not have a Google account, and not have some form of email that you can use in order to, send emails while you're working, or, message your grandma who lives on the other side of the world. We're living in the information age. We're living in a technological revolution where globalization is more important now than ever before. People are living all over the world, okay? And so we really need to start talking about why metadata is no longer a private good, as OP would like you to believe, because we have these things called terms of service agreements which come out of the capitalist model. Okay, we're telling you that metadata is better off as a public good because you get things like more effective universities, you get things like more effective governments, which lend the metadata lends itself to more effective intelligence agencies such as the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. We've given you all these examples of state apparatuses that would use the metadata in order to preempt terrorist acts and other forms of crime that would inherently make the citizenry better off because they're living in societies with lower levels of crime. Okay, we tell you that metadata is better off as a public good because it is inherently public. So they're going to sit up here and tell you that it's aggregated. You can't tell whose specific data it is. But if you look at what the package is made up of, in the same way that the subprime mortgage crisis was made up of a bunch of smaller loans, it was an aggregation of a bunch of really shitty credit mortgages that were bought by people who have really low credit scores. So they're going to try to package these, metadatas as some sort of aggregate, but we argue that metadata is inherently a public good. It is about the individual, it is about their trends, it is about how much time they spend on certain websites and at what intensity they do so. So we argue that metadata is better off as a public good because if we know more about the people in our community, if the farmer in Montana goes and knows more about how much his neighbor is paying for a shovel online versus at his store, that inherently makes the community better off because there's they're a lot closer. And on OPSide, the reason why they're not going to pick up this case, and I'll tell you right now, is because they have not provided sufficient justification for why metadata is already a private good. So they're saying, in capitalism, without the profit incentive, no one's going to want, these multinational corporations aren't going to want to produce metadata. Mind you, they have not justified why these monopolistic giants should even have a stake in people's trends and, in how people are behaving and how they're living their lives as some sort of product that they then sell to ad agencies and marketing firms. So, we're going to sit here and we're going to tell you that, this data is much better off public. Okay, they're going to say, oh, without the profit incentives, we can't do anything. When did we ever say that the government wasn't going to pay these firms for the metadata? We never said that, because the fact of the matter is we are still living in societies with capitalism, but if we have one public good in a capitalist society, it doesn't mean that profits go away. Okay, everybody wants single-payer healthcare system in the U.S., but the reason why we don't have it is because it costs money and we can't afford to fund it yet. So like, they're saying that like profits are their main incentives, and we're telling you that profits won't go away for multinational corporations if we just happen to nationalize it. What we're doing is we're making the smaller businesses better off by leveling the playing field, because right now monopolies have an overwhelming stake in like metadata. So they have companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon are the biggest tech giants in the world, okay? Let me tell you that the first largest search engine in the world is www.google.com, and the second largest is www.youtube.com, which is also owned by the former Google. So there are like so many monopolies in the world. They need to be broken up, and we're telling you that this nationalization instrument is going to be better off. It's going to make everyone better off. It's going to make the citizens better off. It's going to make smaller businesses better off. That their profit margin is not going away on upside, and that there's still the profit incentives, because the government is going to be paying these multinational corporations, not right now, that the government is going to be paying these multinational corporations, and we're going to have a better off citizenry, because they're going to be more intertwined with their community. They're going to be safer, because the governments are going to be able to predict people's trends better. And then also, like, we're going to have better schools. Like, how could you say no to more accurate economic analyses? How could you say no to like more informed psychologists and like more informed sociologists? Like, Op has totally dropped this point that like our research capabilities in a public and private sense are going to be much better off after we nationalize metadata. So we also tell you that like we destigmatize a lot of different kinds of
One clarification. Are you saying that nationalizing this metadata will not affect the revenue of these monopolies, but it will also destroy these monopolies? I'm kind of confused.
So destroying... Okay, so let me just point out that is a false equivalency. So destroying one stream of revenue does not break up a monopoly inherently. Okay, what we're breaking up is the monopoly on metadata by making it publicly available to everyone, as it says in the motion. Okay, and also I'm telling you that the stream of revenue is not going to go away, because the governments are now paying the multinational corporations for their data. Will they take it at a lesser price? I don't know. That's up to be negotiated with the state and the multinational firms. But like, aside from the false equivalency that like Op tries to just bring up here, we're telling you that like we are better off in all cases. Every single actor, state, firm, and citizenry wins on our side of the house. Okay, we get more intertwined communities. We get more educated public and private ventures and individuals. Universities are better off. Technicians and technocrats are better off. People feel less self-conscious about whatever porn they watch, or the fact that they need help with their marriage, or, that they bought a $3 shovel on Amazon instead of from the local farmer. So for all these reasons, we are so proud to tell you that you need to that we need to turn metadata into a public good, that we need to nationalize this, and for all these reasons, we're so proud to propose. Thank you very much.
Or warm in this case.
Yeah, it's a double entendre.
Cool. I'm TL, the last speaker. Okay. So we think one of the bottom lines in the round is that metadata has been continually mischaracterized by everyone who's come up here, and it's honestly going to be very inaccessible even if the government nationalizes it. Because it takes a lot of computational power to actually use it, and it's really only beneficial if you're a giant company that is able to use metadata to figure out which general groups of people to target. It won't really tell you who is looking at what type of porn, or who is looking at the suicide rates. So we think that's been mischaracterized, and now I'd like to go into the contributions from each of the teams in the round. So the first government team brings up these two ideas. One is that it evens the playing field, but yet they're so quick to point, and it like helps out these smaller businesses. But yet they're so quick to point out that companies won't fail, Facebook and Google, because they're going to benefit from ads. Like, really, ads are the way that these companies are able to go, and that's the point they bring up in response. But this argument also applies to them. Smaller businesses don't really care who's buying a shovel or who wants, like, organic tampons. They care about getting their product across. So they're going to buy advertisements whether they have metadata or not. So it doesn't really matter for these smaller businesses and like evening the playing field for these marginalized communities. They don't care what these people are doing. What they care about is getting their message across through advertisements, which is a completely different point and is something they actually bring up. So their response to the opposition is something that's like a very good response to their own argument. No, thank you. They also bring up this idea of like media awareness. And people, like, once it's nationalized, people will now know their metadata is being collected and they'll change things. They don't do a lot of work here, and we also think this is, like, probably not going to happen because people sign agreements every day. They don't really, and they don't even read them. They like the benefits of Facebook and Google a lot more, and, like, nationalizing it won't raise any awareness or change anything in the status quo. So Jordan brings up this, like, fantastic POI that, like, changes the course of the debate, which is that there is no incentive to gather data if you nationalize this metadata. Kaylee like jumps on this and says that good data will no longer exist because now there's no incentive for governments to create this data, or like no incentive for companies to hold this data. Charlotte's response is that everything on a computer is always stored, so of course metadata will exist anyways. So we want to come down like somewhere in between, right? So it's not that like this data will suddenly go bad or that like it's already stored. So they give you like two very extreme points. We want to fall somewhere in the middle, which is probably more realistic, which is that there is no incentive anymore for these governments to like benefit or for these companies to measure this data in a meaningful way that's helpful to them because they can no longer profit off of them. The bottom line that Jordan makes is that companies are profit-driven machines. So if you take away one of their profit sources and just say, give this all to the government, either they're not going to give like quality data to the government anymore, or they're going to figure out more invasive forms of technology and like ways of measuring data that actually benefit them more. So I'll get into that later. So coming out of like the last government team, the member government team, I don't know. So they like paint this like very general picture about technology and trends. So they say like, we're living in a digital age now, and like Alexa has all this data. So wouldn't it be cool if we could figure out things such as like who's watching porn or like different types of porn, and like who is looking up suicide rates? So we think there are several problems with this. The first of which is that metadata isn't useful in doing these things because it's anonymized to the point where it's no longer useful. You can't like figure out who's looking at suicide or not, and at that point, like, it's useless for researchers, and it's useless for people and like public policymakers who want to make these actual decisions that could change people's lives. So that's one of the responses. The second response is that this stuff already exists. So you want to look at like, you want to figure out who's watching what porn. You already know, like, Pornhub measures that, like, people in this state watch this type of porn. So if you're, like, really that curious about it, Dan, you can go online. That data exists. I have good news for you. And, like, they bring up this idea about, like, criminals. The government is now able to figure out what criminals are doing. It's like they haven't been paying any attention to what the NSA has been doing. Like, they monitor everyone in the state. So if like the concern is that we want to know what criminals are doing, we're not going to figure that out through metadata at all. That data already exists and the government is already measured. Yeah. So like generally this applies to a lot of their arguments. This government or this data that they talk about already exists, and metadata, even if it doesn't exist, isn't really going to help them. Plus they're ambiguous benefits, right? They don't really talk about this. Like their bottom line is more data is awesome. Maybe, like, I personally agree with that, but there are lots of cases where that's not necessarily the case. Like, is it really that useful to know what type of porn people are making? Do we want to make better porn? Like, is that something that we want as a society so more people are addicted to it?
Yes.
Also, like, the type of data they want targets individuals. So if, like, theoretically we figure out who is suicidal, we will target them somehow, which I think is like, not in a bad way, but, like, even with the best intentions, we're saying, like, oh, you're at risk of, like, suicide, we want to help you. But that has, like, all sorts of, like, ambiguous benefits. Like, maybe that'll actually hurt someone because they don't want to be put in that group. So they don't do enough work here. So I want to go on to, like, the points that Jordan brings up. So I've, like, given you this picture of how what government offers, they, like, kind of kick themselves in the foot with something because their response to the opposition takes out their arguments about smaller businesses. The lower half of government doesn't really do a good job, and lots of their arguments are ambiguous and not fleshed out enough. So what Jordan offers you is like this really good analysis on on what drives the company. So they care about profit, right? And if the government nationalizes this profit source, this metadata, something's going to happen. Most likely, either like the quality of that data is going down, which is going to negatively impact all of the arguments that government is giving you, because then this data that they're using for all these good things is no longer good and not beneficial anymore. But more likely, these companies are going to gather more harmful data for people, more invasive technology, because if they don't have metadata anymore, they're going to gather specific data on individuals, which then they can profit from even more. It's not like they're going to be, oh yeah, it's okay, we're losing billions of dollars. They're going to change something, and that change is going to be really harmful because they'll invest in more invasive forms of technology that are harmful for all these different types of people, especially marginalized groups who aren't able to protect themselves from like this potential targeting that we're going to see by these companies. Once they no longer have metadata anymore, they have to go to more specific invasive technologies. He also brings up this very realistic point, which is that this is like a huge source of income for multinational companies, and it sets a really negative precedent if the government comes along and takes all that funding away by nationalizing. And so we think several things are going to happen. One, there's going to be less cooperation between these governments and between governments and companies, and also that all of if the U.S. nationalizes it, then Apple or like Google will move away somewhere else, which also has negative consequences. Thank you.
I promise I'll stop.
Then I really don't like